everyone. So we get the wonderful activity of providing a little speech here after lunch, around 2, when people get sleepy. So, yay. Okay, so yes, I went to the University of Guelph. I studied actually rural studies under Dr. Wayne Caldwell. Graduated in 2015. My thesis topic was cooperatives, but as alternate distribution system for local food and community development. So the interesting thing that occurred was a position opened up at the University of Winnipeg, specifically the business chair of cooperative enterprises within their business and administration department. I applied thinking there's no way, I'm new, why would they hire me? They did. And here I am. There we are, all wonderful. So the business chair of cooperative enterprises is actually a position funded by the cooperative sector from Manitoba. So the co-ops, the credit unions, and the provincial government all got together and funded the position in order to advance cooperative knowledge within business schools. The business chair is what we call it. It's a team approach that I use, so I have graduates and undergraduate students who work with me. And we've created a Bachelor of Business Administration degree with a specialization in the management of cooperative enterprises. So there are essentially 5 classes that we've developed over the last 2 years. I started in 2015. Fundamentals of cooperatives, so it gives a basic idea of what a cooperative is all about. Then we get into the management of co-op, cooperative entrepreneurship, accounting and performance measures of co-ops, which is just one of the most riveting classes for students. They love it. And of course then financing a cooperative enterprise. So we've created all of those programs because in most business schools, co-ops are either a footnote or not mentioned at all. So part of this talk that I'm actually going to do today is to introduce what a co-op is, to give you a sense of where they began, when they began, also what inspired modern co-ops. Where did they get their ideas from? Where did they see the world going? And then an idea of what current co-ops are doing today, how they're actually working today. So, without further ado, I'll do the clicker thing. There we go. So, the definition of cooperatives. This was developed in 1995 by the International Cooperative Alliance, the ICA. And if you'll forgive me, I'll just read it out a little bit. A cooperative is an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. It's a rather lengthy definition. My students are quite thrilled to see it because it's not as simple as saying my business is to make a profit or to create value for my shareholders. They not only have to understand what an autonomous association is, but they have to understand what is meant by common economic, social, and cultural needs. You'll notice in the definition there's actually no mention of profit. It's more along the lines of jointly owned, democratically controlled enterprise, which is sort of the instigation of, or the incorporation, sorry, of democracy within an economic entity, a firm itself, which is sort of contrary to the current structure of most corporations, which is generally presented as a pyramid, the CEOs on top, etc., whereas cooperatives are normally presented as inverted pyramids. The membership on top, followed by the board of directors, followed by the CEO. Not only is the definition itself somewhat lengthy and somewhat convoluted, but you also have to include the 7 principles. Now, I've pared them down. I haven't included all the information into the 7 principles, but the 7 principles basically outline what governs the actions of a cooperative. So voluntary and open membership. So anyone and everyone can be a member of a co-op. Democratic member control. One of the key criteria of a cooperative is to allow the members to actually take control of their organization, to make decisions based on what they sell, when they sell it, and how they sell it. Member economic participation. This particular principle, not only the requirement of the membership to provide capital to the firm, but it's also the bane of cooperative existence. It's the limited nature of capital access for a cooperative firm. So unlike a traditional firm, if you wanted to gain access to more capital, you can go onto the stock exchange, you can go to banks, gain capital that way. Member economic participation means you have to go to your membership. They have to supply the capital first, which means the membership is limited, which means your capital is limited. Then, of course, autonomy and independence. This we'll get into a little later on when we start talking about the federated structure of cooperatives. Nowadays, cooperatives can actually work with other cooperatives, as you can see from principle number 6, cooperation among cooperatives. One of the longest standing principles is education, training, and information. It has been key for cooperatives, and we'll touch base on that a little later on in the presentation. But as far as developing labor, encouraging labor to gain skills, and developing human capital, education, training, and information has been around since the beginning of cooperatives. And finally, concern for community, which is the newest principle for cooperatives, basically states that the membership will actually consider the community's needs in their activities. This is interesting because it can make a bit of a conflict between membership needs and community needs, which the cooperative has to deal with. What's also interesting is when you want to actually figure out when cooperatives started, it makes it very difficult. The definition is very convoluted. The principles are sometimes used as a checklist. You must have all 7 to be considered a co-op. Other times they're considered as simply guidelines, and you do not have to follow them all. So, for example, before the International Cooperative Alliance in 1995, some people considered a merchants co-op that was granted a charter by William the Lion in 1179 as the first cooperative. The issue here, the cooperative developed because the merchants wanted to provide a protection to its actual market so they could make a profit for their community. They wanted to carry out some small trading in a very free and peaceable manner, which they weren't being allowed to do. This, however, this particular merchants organization, or some people may even call it a buying club, is considered not a cooperative by some because of the member economic participation principle. Members are usually provided with equity from the company, which basically violates the particular member economic participation principle. The member economic participation principle, if you say it 5 times fast, really hurts. No, is a principle that's been handed down because the idea was that excess consumption was considered a sin. There was a link between cooperatives and the Catholic beliefs at the time, which basically said you have to have concern for your community, which then later developed into the concern for community principle. So what we have here is the possibility of co-ops beginning in 1179 if you're a little flexible on whether or not all the principles must be obeyed, or whether or not they're simply guiding principles. Others suggest that the Shores Porter Society was the very first cooperative in 1498. This is a haulage and storage company. It was incorporated in order to protect their workers and to provide for times when the workers were sick and they couldn't actually provide services and get paid. They were also there for retired workers to address their needs. So again, if you look at the two co-ops, the two co-ops in quotes, the focus is on labor. Labor needs, how to address labor issues, such as pension plans or health plans, things of that nature. The society, unfortunately, was considered not really a co-op because it was a semi-public body at the time. The actual town council was involved, so it was a partnership, which means the autonomy and independence principle was sort of violated. Because cooperatives are supposed to be autonomous and independent and addressing their membership's needs, economic, social, and cultural, how does that jibe with the fact that the town council was involved and actually running this particular business. So was it a public company or was it a co-op? These debates go on, but the question is, if you look at the heart of the activities of the cooperatives, as they are called, their focus is on labor, right, and how to actually address the labor's needs or their members' needs. What I'd like to talk to you about next is, that was the beginnings of co-ops. It's a little convoluted, but where did the actual inspiration from co-ops come from? Where did the inspiration from modern co-ops first arrive? Well, in 1760, 1825, utopian socialists came about. Henry de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, Robert Owen. These individuals basically put forward an idea that there's a different way of doing business. There's a different way of taking care of your community, your members, right? They presented visions of an idealistic or future-type society, which we'll take a look at in a moment for each one of them. While they provided a roadmap for the development of a society, the idea was to do it through economic activity. So you couldn't have one without the other, right? So both Charles Fourier and Robert Owen were considered fathers of the cooperative movement, and we'll take a little look at exactly what that means. So Charles Fourier, he believed in an intentional community. So you can start seeing an idea of what cooperators consider society and economy being mixed together, right? It's a community designed from the very start, from the very beginning, a blank slate, right? He wanted to create a high degree of social cohesion to avoid the class conflicts of the time. He also wanted to encourage teamwork, so he had a great deal of education incorporated into his utopian societies, his pre-made communities, in order to bring people together. The main focus of his cooperatives was because of the comment, the quote, serving the knavery of merchants, right? Which is basically talking about the fact that he believed merchants were taking too much from society. They were taking it in shifty means. They were not helping out communities, they were taking from communities, right? Interestingly enough, because of that, he actually called for the abolishment of private capital. So no one in these communities, these intentional communities, was supposed to have any actual capital involved in the community, so they couldn't override decisions of the community, right? This would hopefully then eliminate competition. No one would be fighting for specific rare resources, scarce resources. He did actually create a concept of a community called phalanxes, and they were based around these grand hotel images. So they look sort of like this, right? And if you look at it, oh, hey, loud. If you look at it, the idea is that they were an enclosed community so that people wouldn't be encouraged to interact with a competitive community next door, right? These communities are very similar to Robert Owen's communities, which we'll get into in a moment. So, like Fourier, Robert Owen, he believed in these intentional communities, these planned communities, not just on a social or political level, but on an economic level as well. What's interesting with Robert Owen is, though, he believed that man has no inborn aspiration to freedom, which means an awful lot when you're talking about the difference between cooperation, competition, and what Robert Owen was presenting, right? He believed that man was encouraged or developed around his environment. So if you change a person's environment, you will change the individual into a better person, right? Thus, he promoted mass education, right? This is where the education, training, and information principle comes from, right? The idea that people could actually learn to be better was encouraged by Robert Owen. Interestingly enough, like Fourier, though, he did take a paternalistic approach to community development, right? He actually specified 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours of rest. Whether you need it or not, you're getting it. Time for bed, right? So the idea of Robert Owen having these communities and basically saying, okay, you've done your 8 hours, now you have to rest, is sort of taking the work-life balance to extremes. Right? Robert Owen did have followers. They were called followers, and they were called Owenites. This is where the difference between, and there is a debate in the co-op world, whether or not we have a cooperative business model or cooperative movement. Right? If you take a look at what Fourier and Owen are presenting, you could almost call this a cult-like approach to dealing with society. Right? Everyone go to bed, it's time for bed, everyone get up, it's time to work, that sort of thing. Right? Interestingly enough, Robert Owen did develop these 3 communities, New Lanark, Orbiston, and New Harmony. So if we take a look at New Lanark, established in 1799, 2,500 people lived there. Right? Interestingly enough, they were taken from poorhouses in Glasgow and Edinburgh. This was sort of Robert Owen's big experiment. Take people out of the environment in which they have found themselves in trouble and put them into a nice environment with rivers and streams and trees and improve them that way. Really? 5 minutes? Are you sure? Moving on. He also established Orbiston in 1825 with a population of 300. This was essentially a manor house with a few outbuildings. And then, of course, New Harmony in Indiana. So we actually took it to the States as an experiment with a 1,000-member population. All of these communities failed because of the paternalistic approach to dealing with community. What would end up happening is people would get back up on their feet and say, thank you, I've had enough of the 8-hour schedule. I'm going to now go to Edinburgh and enjoy myself. This leads to the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers. These fellows were actually inspired by the utopian socialists to develop what are considered the modern cooperative principles. The Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers, also known as the Rochdale Pioneers, developed actually 12 principles of which a co-op was supposed to follow. These have been since pared down to the 7 that we see by the ICA. Right? Again, however, the Rochdale Pioneers focused on the issues of their community, what the community needed. So the community was being cheated by company stores, high prices, right? They also had no way of saving up because they spent all their money on basic necessities. They also needed a place to actually create a community, places to meet, places to let their voices be heard, right? 28 people got together, £1 apiece, and they started the cooperative movement on Toad Lane. Yeah. The store originally opened only for 1 or 2 days a week, but in the first quarter they actually made a profit. By 1850, 600 members. It's quite impressive. They actually started then developing value-added industries, so the Corn Mill Society, they had a wholesaler. They actually created building co-ops to house their members to ensure everyone has a home. They had a mutual bank to provide for capital for their membership. They also created schools, meeting halls, and libraries. These are all outside what would normally be considered standard business practices of the time. Interestingly enough, the Rochdale Pioneers, this is where we run to Canada now. The Rochdale Pioneers were the inspiration for the Desjardins in Quebec. Alphonse and Dominier Desjardins established the first Caisse Populaire in 1900 in Lévis, Quebec. Right? This is the People's Bank. The idea of the People's Bank being established is because of the high usury rates of the time. For the banks, farmers could not get a decent loan from the banks. So the issue was, how do they get together and address this issue to increase the community wealth, right? And decrease the stagnation of the rural economy of the time. What's interesting, though, is the Desjardins I took from the utopian. Really? 2 minutes? Come on. Okay. What's interesting is the Desjardins I took from the utopian socialists, the actual issue of economic disempowerment and democratic freedoms. The two actually work together in the Desjardins' minds, because without actually being able to have a say in your economic activities, how do you actually build up a community that you actually want? I won't read the quote, but it's an interesting quote for you to take a look at, because I only have 2 minutes left. The Quebec parishes played a major part in developing the Caisse Populaire, which is where we start getting again back into the debate between business model and movement within the cooperative world, right? Because we're talking about bringing in the beliefs of the Catholic Church into a business organization. Right? An interesting quote I always tell my students: the man who dies thus rich dies disgraced, because the concept of inequality or wealth consolidation becomes an issue within an individual community that co-ops hope to address. Right? What's also of interest is that within these parish-based firms, the Catholic Church and the elite of the community actually are the ones who started developing it. It wasn't the farmers or the rural poor that started developing the Caisse Populaire. It was actually the elite, the businessmen, the lawyers, the doctors, things of that nature, who actually got together and said, our communities need something. The farmers need something. They need access to funds without these huge usury rates, these huge interest rates, so let's get together and provide them with something. This included the issue of community within a business setting, right? So the Caisse Populaire helped individual communities to gain access to capital, which then allowed them to create value-added industries within the Quebec system. Interestingly enough, the Quebec cooperatives were based on the spirit of the Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo. I just call him Leo. He's a good guy. Pope Leo XIII on capital and labor. So around 1891, just before the first Caisse Populaire was developed, the Pope came out with this address in terms of how businesses should interact with their labor, right? As well as the issues of capital. So if you look at the very second to last one, every man has by nature the right to possess property as his own, an ability to be their own individual within the community. Finally, today, how are co-ops stacking up in terms of what they're actually doing? Well, within Quebec, there's actually 3,238 co-ops across a number of sectors, both financial and non-financial. There are 21,595 million in sales and almost 89,000 jobs. What's interesting about these jobs, however, is if you take a look at the co-ops versus the Quebec economy, you're looking at annual job growth rate of 7.2 versus 2.1, so quite a significant difference. But also, if you look at the survival rate of co-ops, you're looking at co-ops within the first 5 years surviving almost twice as much, twice as long, potential of surviving twice as much as the private sector, and within 10 years it is over twice the probability of them surviving. This is because of the focus on labor and the fact that they do have a membership base that provides them with capital. Today there's a lot, I only have probably a minute left, but today there's a lot more to discover in terms of co-ops. There's the issue of the Antigonish movement out in Nova Scotia, the Ontario movement, and how it differs from the Quebec movement because they did not have the influence of the parishes, the Catholic clergy, and the Prairies movement, which tend to focus more along the lines of buying clubs and how they interacted with the development of the Grain Growers Grain Company, right, the GGG. Finally, just a bit of a touch in terms of rural social enterprise and the trends towards rural social enterprise today. If you look at cooperatives, it's a democratic control and economic activity mix, but what's actually happening, Arctic Co-ops Limited is a federated structured co-op that's based in Winnipeg, but it covers 32 stores across northern Canada to address rural and remote communities that may or may not even have a store. Some of the stores within the rural and remote communities up north, it's the northern store, Northwest Company Limited. The northern store has been accused of being very similar to company stores, right, with high costs, taking funds out of the community. Arctic Co-op, with their 32 cooperatives, as you can see by the quote there, is actually providing some economic power to the communities in order for them to establish themselves and keep funds within the community. For example, here is just a glance at all the communities that do have an Arctic cooperative within them. I recently went to Nyack in Nunavut, which is a fairly large community of 1,200 people. They actually have a co-op store and a northern store. I went to, it says Holman there, but it's actually called Lulahuktuk in Northwest Territories. And they have a northern store, a co-op, as well as a convenience store with a population of only 450. And finally, I went to Old Crow in the Yukon, one of the smallest communities of 300 people, and they only have an Arctic co-op store. For 6 months, they had no store at all. They had no ability to actually bring in retail or service goods whatsoever. So just as a quick conclusion, because I'm probably over time, communities and businesses need to be linked for a successful community, especially when it comes to up north. Many rural communities are seeing skills out migration. This can be addressed by the co-op's education, training, and information principle and concern for community principles. They represent a labor-focused firm, hence you see the increased success rate of most co-ops, and they offer goods and services in rural areas that most companies will not even go.